Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we unpack complex sources, pull out a core ideas really just for you.
That's right.
And today, we're jumping into some really thought-provoking stuff from the text, In the Minds of Men.
Hmm.
Our goal, basically, is to explore this whole interplay between revelation, reason, and, scientific theories, how they've shaped how we see everything.
And this source, it covers a huge amount of ground, historically
Mm.
speaking. It shows how science, philosophy, religion, society, they all kind of develop side by side, influencing each other.
Right.
We'll see how these different takes on, where we came from, they weren't just academic debates. They actually had real-world effects. Big ones, sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll dig into some surprising connections, some debates that, well, they just keep going, don't they? From ancient thinkers right up to Darwin and questions about Earth's age, fossils, all that.
That's a rich tapestry.
Okay, so let's kick things off with that central tension, revelation versus reason. How does the text set that up?
Well, it presents revelation as knowledge you can't just get through your normal senses. Things like, say, the origin of the universe or what the soul is or, biblical accounts of resurrection.
Means you can't exactly put under a microscope.
Exactly. They're presented as truths that require faith, a belief in something beyond direct observation or scientific proof.
Yeah.
So that's the core idea. Knowledge through faith beyond the empirical.
And then the flip side is human reason, using observation, logic, evidence to figure things out naturally.
Right. And the text makes it pretty clear these two haven't always played nicely together, led to major divisions historically.
You mean like conflicts among Greek philosophers? Or the Reformation?
Those are perfect examples. Deep disagreements about the source of truth. And the text also warns about mixing claims of divine revelation with, well, earthly power.
How so?
It mentions Plato's Republic as maybe an early model, but then suggests that even a purely rational scientific view, if it becomes unquestionable dogma, could be seen as a factor in big upheavals like the French, Russian, and Chinese revolutions.
So the danger lies in any single source of truth, religious or rational, becoming absolute in politics.
That seems to be the insight, yeah, when it's unchallenged.
Okay, right. So from those big picture clashes, the text then zooms in on some early attempts at natural explanations, like Lucretius.
Lucretius, yeah, Roman philosopher, 1st century BCE, he laid out this really influential materialistic viewpoint in De Natura Rerum,
Materialistic meaning.
meaning an atomistic universe. Everything made of atoms, operating by mechanical processes, chance, natural laws, no room for gods interfering, no active creator pulling the
The
string,
universe just runs itself.
pretty much. But here's the interesting bit the text points out. He starts his poem with this prayer to nature, personified as Venus.
Huh. That does sound a bit contradictory, doesn't it, if he's ruling out the gods?
It is fascinating. Maybe it shows that even early naturalists weren't always perfectly consistent, or perhaps it wasn't a total rejection, but more like reimagining the ultimate force as nature itself.
So still a sense of reverence, but directed differently.
Could be that human impulse to find some foundational principle, perhaps.
Interesting. Okay, jumping ahead now. The early church and the rise of science. The text gives a more nuanced picture than just church versus science, right?
Definitely. People often think of constant conflict, but the text stresses the church's role in preserving knowledge early on. They copied texts from people like Galen, Aristotle,
Even though those texts had errors.
even though they had errors, yes. So, in a way, the church acted as custodians of learning, not just opponents.
Like librarians almost. And it also mentions positive contributions during the so-called Dark Ages.
Yeah, it credits the church with establishing hospitals, schools, often the only education available, and even the first universities in Europe.
Right.
But then, inevitably, you get the clash. The church's core beliefs, divine creation, a global flood, start running up against scientific observations. That sets the stage for the later conflicts.
Which brings us to Aristotle and Aquinas. Huge figures.
Absolutely massive. Aristotle's focus on reason and observation was powerful. But some ideas, like maybe the soul not being immortal, directly clashed with Scripture.
And the text compares his impact to Darwin's.
Yeah, it says Aristotle in the 12th century was maybe as disruptive as Darwin in the 19th. Both offered these compelling systems based on reason, but they challenged established religious views.
And Aquinas tried to bridge that gap.
Exactly. Thomas Aquinas. He undertook this huge project to integrate Aristotle's humanism with Christian theology, trying to show faith and reason could work together.
Complement each other, not conflict.
That was the goal. And his work had a massive lasting impact, especially on Catholic thought, shows that desire to harmonize reason and belief.
Okay, next big shift. The Reformation and the printing press. How did they change the game for revelation and reason?
Well, the Reformation, with figures like Wycliffe, Luther, it was largely about getting the Bible into people's hands in their own language.
And the printing press made that possible on a mass scale.
Precisely. Suddenly, individuals could engage directly with Scripture. The texts suggest this was like a form of personal revelation, understanding God through the text itself.
So kind of democratized revelation, less reliance on church authority.
In many ways, yes. It contrasted sharply with the Catholic Church's approach, formalized at the Council of Trent, which leaned heavily on tradition, papal authority, and Aquinas' framework.
You can see how the press just fueled those different approaches.
Absolutely, spread ideas like wildfire.
And it wasn't just Bibles being printed, right? The Renaissance saw Greek texts rediscovered, too.
Yes, the printing press spread those classical Greek works far and wide, which is great for knowledge, but also reintroduced some of the scientific errors of Aristotle and Galen that needed correcting later.
So progress, but with some old baggage attached. Okay, let's talk Enlightenment. Big emphasis on reason there. How did they see religion?
Well, Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Hume, Mill, that crowd, they really championed human reason. And many started seeing established religion as, frankly, a source of problems, ignorance, oppression.
So they pushed for reason as the primary guide.
Very much so. Yeah. Human agency, rational inquiry, those were seen as the keys to understanding the world and organizing society. Religious explanations often got pushed aside. Reason took center stage.
Okay, so we've covered philosophy, religion. Now the text turns towards biology. Classification, early evolutionary hints. Linnaeus is key here.
Carl Linnaeus, yeah.
Yeah.
His system for classifying life using Latin terms became standard. He used the word species, which subtly shifted things away from the biblical idea of kinds.
How so?
Well, his initial idea of fixed, unchanging species brought order, but it also, maybe unintentionally, set the stage for later ideas that would challenge that very fixity.
Like Buffon and Lamarck, they started questioning if species really were fixed.
Right. Buffon thought the environment could cause changes in traits, and those changes could be passed on, acquired characteristics.
Like a giraffe stretching its neck and passing that longer neck down.
That's the classic Lamarckian example, yeah. Lamarck took it further, really pushing an evolutionary view, though he didn't use the word evolution. The text notes the church was pretty quiet about him, probably because of the French Revolution happening then.
And Lamarck's ideas, they didn't quite hold up in the end.
No, the mechanism he proposed, inheritance of acquired traits, turned out to be largely incorrect. But it was an important step towards evolutionary thinking.
Then comes Cuvier. Fossils, catastrophism. How did he try to square fossils with the Bible?
Georges Cuvier, a brilliant anatomist. Studying fossils, he saw evidence of mass extinctions, big die-offs.
Okay.
So he proposed these cycles. Catastrophe wipes things out, then new life appears or repopulates. And he tried to fit this with Genesis by saying the biblical flood was just the last one in the series.
Ah, so he acknowledged the fossil evidence but kept the flood as the final act, fitting a shorter timeline.
Exactly. It was an attempt to reconcile the rocks with the scriptures.
Yeah.
Catastrophism.
But then Charles Lyell came along with a very different idea. Uniformitarianism.
Right. Lyell, building on James Hutton's work, argued that the geological processes we see happening now, erosion, sedimentation, volcanoes, are the same ones that shape the Earth over vast amounts of time.
Slow and gradual, not sudden catastrophes.
Primarily slow and gradual, yes.
Yeah.
This directly challenged Cuvier's catastrophism, and more importantly, the Genesis account of a recent creation and global flood.
And this idea of deep time was crucial for Darwin, wasn't it?
Absolutely crucial. Lyell's geology provided the immense timescale that Darwin's theory of slow, gradual evolution by natural selection seemed to need. Lyell's influence was huge, setting the stage for biology's big shift.
Which neatly brings us to Wallace and Darwin, that near-simultaneous discovery of natural selection. Quite a story there.
It really is. Alfred Russel Wallace, out in the Malay Archipelago, independently comes up with the core idea of evolution by natural selection.
Wow. While Darwin was still sitting on his ideas back in England.
Pretty much. Wallace sent his paper to Darwin in 1858. Darwin had been working on it for decades but hadn't published.
That must have lit a fire under him.
You bet. It led to that joint presentation of their papers. But the text also mentions others, like Edward Blythe and Patrick Matthew, who had published similar ideas earlier.
And Darwin didn't cite them.
Not in the origin, no. So there's a bit of historical debate about Who knew what when? It's also interesting, Wallace later got deeply into Spiritism.
Okay, so a complex history. Let's break down Darwin's theory itself. What are the core assumptions laid out in the text?
Okay, so first, there's variation within any species. Individuals differ.
Sure, like dogs. Lots of variation.
Exactly. Second, organisms produce more offspring than can possibly survive. Malthus's idea, really, leads to a struggle for existence.
Right, limited resources.
Third, in that struggle, individuals with traits better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. That's natural selection, or survival of the fittest. Fourth, common ancestry. The idea that all life ultimately traces back to a single origin.
The evolutionary tree.
Right. And fifth, gradualism. Change happens slowly, from simple to complex, over those vast timescales Lyell talked about.
But the text mentions some issues, like circular reasoning with fossils.
Yeah, it points out the potential tautology.
Hmm.
The fossil order proves evolution, and evolution explains the fossil order. It also notes there's still no universal agreement on the exact mechanism driving all evolutionary change.
And what about the actual fossil evidence? The text gives examples that seem to suggest rapid events, not slow change.
It does. Fossils like an ichthyosaur caught giving birth, or a fish swallowing another fish, they look like they were buried suddenly, catastrophically.
Not slowly covered over millions of years.
Doesn't look like it. It also contrasts things like the La Brea tar pits, where animals got stuck, with finds like the frozen mammoths in Siberia whole, preserved, suggesting maybe a very rapid, widespread event.
And living fossils, like the coelacanth, they don't seem to have changed much.
Exactly. The coelacanth, thought extinct for millions of years then found alive, looking pretty much the same. Or that strange carcass netted by Japanese fishermen that some thought resembled a plesiosaur. These raise questions about constant, gradual change.
So the text presents these as challenges to the standard view and mentions alternative interpretations.
Yes, it introduces a reproduction repopulation model linked to the Genesis flood as another way to interpret the fossil sequence, and points to things like out-of-place fossils or geological oddities as potential evidence for a flood.
Okay. Shifting focus slightly, the text mentions a Unitarian influence on Darwin. What's that about?
Well, the Unitarian Church had beliefs different from Orthodox Christianity, rejecting the Trinity, for instance. And Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was Unitarian.
Ah,
And so were other key figures Darwin knew or was influenced by, like Joseph Priestley, James Hutton.
they were part of an intellectual circle questioning traditional beliefs, emphasizing reason.
So Darwin was breathing that air, intellectually speaking. It seems likely. The text suggests this environment probably influenced him, especially since he nearly became a clergyman himself. It wasn't a vacuum, it was a time of questioning.
Got it. And his voyage on the Beagle, that 5-year trip, was obviously pivotal.
Hugely. Captain Fitzroy was actually hoping the voyage would confirm Genesis. Darwin was the naturalist.
Kind of ironic then.
Very. Darwin started with, the text suggests, maybe limited geology and theology knowledge, but 5 years of intense observation, collecting samples. That's where the ideas really started to form.
Influenced by Malthus on population, and maybe Blythe's earlier ideas.
Yes, Malthus's struggle for existence was key, and the text raises the possibility he drew on Blythe's writings about variation and selection, even if unconsciously. It was a period of massive intellectual development for him.
And the text mentions his personal life too, health struggles, family issues.
Briefly, yes. His own chronic health problems after the voyage, illnesses among his children. His wife Emma was a huge support. But it also highlights his determination to get his theory accepted, his anxiety about proving it.
Which might explain why he delayed publishing for so long.
Could be part of it. The weight of the implications, the desire for solid proof.
So when Origin of Species finally came out in 1859, after the Wallace prompt, it sidestepped human origins?
Smartly, yes. He avoided the biggest controversy initially. The text notes the counter-arguments already present, like the biblical after his kind idea, or the fact that hybrids like mules are sterile, suggesting species barriers.
Right.
It talks about Darwin's Galapagos finches, his developing ideas on divergence, but also the limits seen in breeding. You can breed dogs, pigeons, horses, but they stay dogs, pigeons, horses. Darwin thought maybe over enough time, those barriers could break.
But the fossil record was still a problem, the missing links.
A major problem, and Darwin knew it. He acknowledged the lack of clear transitional forms. The text uses the horse series, Eohippus, etc., as an example where the links are debated, fossils found out of order sometimes. It's not as neat as the textbooks often show it.
And the argument that transitions happen in soft tissues that don't fossilize.
The text calls that an argument from silence, basically saying the evidence is missing because it's missing. It mentions the penguin flipper as a living example sometimes used, but questions the strength of that analogy.
Okay. What about design? The peacock's tail, the eye. How did Darwin explain apparent purpose without a designer?
That was a huge struggle for him. Artificial selection has a goal, but natural selection is supposed to be blind. How does chance variation and survival produce something as complex and seemingly designed as an eye, or a peacock's elaborate tail?
What was his answer?
He argued that even tiny incremental steps, if they offered some advantage, could eventually build up complex structures over long periods. But he admitted it seemed, quote, absurd in the highest possible degree when thinking about the eye.
And the text asks us, the listener, to think about adaptation. Do species really adapt or just move or die out when things change, especially rapid change?
Right, and it hammers home that lack of clear fossil transitions as a major hurdle for the theory at the time.
Then there's Gregor Mendel. His genetics work was happening right then, but completely ignored.
Unbelievably, yes. Published in 1865, but nobody really noticed until 1900. It was the missing piece. Darwin needed a mechanism for how traits are inherited, a huge gap in his original theory.
Wow. So Darwinism lacked the hereditary mechanism. Then came mutation theory and neo-Darwinism later.
Mhm.
How did they try to fill that gap?
Well, Hugo de Vries suggested big mutations could create new species suddenly. Experiments, like with fruit flies, showed mutations caused variation, but didn't really make new species.
Okay.
So that led to the modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinism. Thinkers like Huxley, Mayer, they combined Darwin's natural selection with Mendelian genetics and mutation.
So mutations provide the raw variation, selection acts on it.
Exactly. Favorable mutations get selected, isolation helps new species form. They argue that the continuous variation Darwin saw wasn't enough on its own. You needed mutations.
But even neo-Darwinism faced challenges, like Gould's punctuated equilibria.
Right. Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge proposed punctuated equilibria. The idea is that species stay stable for long stretches, then have relatively rapid bursts of change, often around speciation events.
So not slow and steady, but fits and starts.
Kind of, yeah. It challenged the strict gradualism of neo-Darwinism. The text contrasts this with people like Louis Leakey, who claimed fossil finds were filling the gaps for gradualism. Still debated.
And the text revisits Darwin's struggle with complexity, using the eye again.
Yes, emphasizing his own admission of absurdity, but also his attempt to solve it by imagining numerous, gradual, advantageous steps. It includes a direct quote showing his reasoning.
What about extinction? Does evolution fully explain why some successful creatures died out?
The text asks that question. Why did things like the Irish elk with its huge antlers or the woolly mammoth disappear? Were they really poorly adapted? Why did others survive tough times? It suggests standard explanations might not cover everything.
Okay, let's pivot to the origin of life itself. Spontaneous generation, the idea life just arises from non-life. Big debate there.
Huge historical debate. The text mentions ready disproving it for maggots, and Pasteur, famously, for microbes. Pasteur was driven by his faith, actually.
Interesting.
It also touches on claims of fossil cells in meteorites, like the Orgai meteorite, which were later dismissed as contamination or hoaxes.
Then you have Ernst Haeckel, a huge promoter of Darwinism who also pushed a biogenesis life from non-life.
Yeah, Haeckel was a very passionate, almost dogmatic advocate. The text contrasts his style with Huxley's caution. It mentions the Challenger expedition finding Monera, which Haeckel thought was primordial slime, proof of abiogenesis.
But that turned out to be wrong.
Completely wrong. It was just a chemical precipitate. The text calls it a fiasco that the scientific community kind of swept under the rug.
And around that same time, people like Percival Lowell were convinced there were canals on Mars.
Yes. Lowell was certain Martians built canals, based on Schiaparelli's observations. The timing is interesting. Just as Haeckel's primordial slime was discredited, people started looking to space for life's origins.
Which leads to what the text calls the dilemma. If life doesn't arise spontaneously, does that imply creation?
That's the philosophical crux. If you rule out spontaneous generation, and we haven't made life in the lab, the alternative seems to be purposeful creation.
What about Haeckel's idea that it happened way back when conditions were different?
He proposed that, but it clashed with Lyell's uniformitarianism, the idea that conditions were broadly similar in the past. It didn't really catch on. Panspermia life arriving from space is another idea mentioned to get around the origin problem here on Earth.
Then comes operance theory, the main scientific model now.
Alexander Oparin's chemical evolution theory. Simple chemicals in a primitive atmosphere. Energy sources like lightning, forming complex molecules, eventually self-replicating cells.
But it relies on huge amounts of time and chance.
Very much so. The text highlights the immense complexity of DNA, RNA, proteins, and the chicken and egg problem of how they could arise and work together by chance. It also notes the revival of panspermia ideas, life's building blocks, or even microbes coming from space. Still no definitive proof, though.
Okay, let's talk fossil humans. The text stresses how preconceptions influence interpretations here.
Hugely important point. What people expected to find often shaped how they saw the fossils. Neanderthals, for example, first seen as diseased modern humans, later reconstructed by Boole as stooped ape men, now seen as a distinct human group, Homo neanderthalensis.
And Piltdown Man, a deliberate hoax that fooled scientists for decades.
A classic example. Human skull parts, ape jaw, stained to look old, found near Darwin's home. Missing the key connecting parts, allowing interpretation to fit the missing link idea, exposed as a fraud in 1953, shows how badly people wanted to find that link.
What other controversial missing links does the text mention?
Rhodesian man skull, found with what looked like a drilled hole, suggesting maybe more advanced capabilities than expected. Nebraska man hyped during the Scopes trial based on a single tooth.
Yeah.
Turned out to be from an extinct pig.
A pig's tooth? Seriously?
Seriously. Quietly vanished from textbooks later. Peking man is also mentioned, questioning how much reconstruction shaped the evidence, and noting a suppressed report of human tools found at the same site, which complicates the timeline.
Then the focus shifts to Africa. Australopithecus, the Leakey's finds. Also, lots of debate there.
Absolutely. Dart's Australopithecus africanus, controversial at first. Leakey's Zinjanthropus, Nutcracker man, had dating issues. 1470 man also had dating uncertainties. Then you have Homo habilis, Lucy. The text emphasizes the ongoing arguments about where they all fit. Direct ancestors, side branches. It's not a simple ladder.
And the idea that bigger brains automatically mean more intelligence, the text debunks that too.
Yeah, points out that old idea from Broca isn't accurate. Gives examples like Turgenev and Anatole France, very different brain sizes, both highly intelligent. Sizes and everything.
What about vestigial organs? Weren't they seen as proof of evolution?
Darwin listed things like ear muscles, wisdom teeth, appendix, cossytax as useless leftovers. But the text argues that many of these are now known to have functions. The appendix, for example, has immune functions.
And people aren't born with tails that need removing.
No, that's a misunderstanding of a rare birth defect.
Right.
So the argument from vestigial organs is much weaker now than it was in Darwin's time.
Okay, shifting again. Ancient creation and flood stories. The text says they're found worldwide.
Remarkably widespread, yes. Across ancient cultures, Babylonian, Egyptian, Chinese, Indian, Persian, and others, all have creation accounts and often flood narratives, and the dates associated with them generally don't go back further than maybe 7,000 BC.
Which clashes massively with the billion-year scientific timescale.
Massively. And the text notes the flood legends share common themes, often aligning quite closely with the Genesis account, suggests maybe a common historical memory.
This leads right back to the age of the Earth. That huge discrepancy seems central.
It really is fundamental. Thousands of years versus billions underpins completely different views of history and life. Lyell's geology needed deep time for Darwinism to work.
And the text mentions early attempts to date the Earth gave younger ages.
Yes, like Josley's calculations based on salt in the oceans. They gave results much younger than billions of years, though those methods had their own issues.
Which brings us to radiometric dating. Uranium, lead, potassium, argon, carbon-14. How does the text critique these?
It explains the basics, radioactive decay, half-life, but then it digs into the core assumptions.
Which are?
1, you assume zero-daughter product was present initially. 2, you assume the rock has been a closed system, nothing leaked in or out. 3, you assume the decay rate has been constant for billions of years.
And the text argues these assumptions might be flawed.
It discusses potential problems, initial daughter contamination, leakage of parent or daughter isotopes, those are gases like argon, and the fact that we can't directly prove decay rates were constant over billions of years. It's an extrapolation.
So the precise dates depend heavily on assumptions you can't definitively test.
That's the argument presented. It then gives specific challenges.
Like the polonium halos.
Right. Robert Gentry's work on radio halos in granite, which he argued suggest incredibly rapid, maybe instantaneous, formation of granite, challenging the whole slow-cooling, deep-time model.
And carbon-14 dating.
Explains how it works, based on the C14-C12 ratio, but notes assumptions there too, constant pass ratio, equilibrium. Points out C14 seems to be forming faster than it decays, suggesting the system isn't in equilibrium, maybe implying a younger atmosphere, and its limited range only useful for maybe 50,000 years max, with increasing uncertainty.
And even if different methods give similar dates.
The text argues consistency doesn't prove the underlying assumptions are correct, especially if they all share similar potential flaws.
Beyond dating methods, what other evidence for a younger Earth does the text offer?
Several things. Issues with the standard model of the sun, missing neutrinos. The amount of meteoritic dust on Earth and the Moon seems too little if it's been accumulating for billions of years. Earth's internal heat, shouldn't it have cooled more?
The magnetic field decay.
Yes, Barnes's analysis suggesting the field is decaying rapidly, pointing to a recent origin. Helium in the atmosphere, again, seems like there should be much more if it's been building up for billions of years from radioactive decay.
And population growth.
Yeah, simple calculations suggesting that if humans had been around for millions or even hundreds of thousands of years, the population should be astronomically larger, even with wars and famines. These are presented as converging lines of evidence questioning the vast ages.
Definitely alternative perspectives. The text then talks about worship in a broader sense.
Yeah, extending it beyond religion. Allegiance to ideologies, political figures,
Yeah.
even scientific paradigms can take on aspects of a belief system people are devoted to.
And how did traditional religion, the church, react specifically to evolution?
Well, initially, fossil collecting was popular, sometimes seen as confirming the flood. But as geology linked fossils to deep time and challenged Genesis, there was backlash. The Oxford debate, Wilberforce versus Huxley, was a famous flashpoint.
Because rejecting a literal Genesis raised theological problems.
Big ones. If Genesis isn't literally true, what about other parts of the Bible? What about Christ's references to Genesis? It forced people to reconsider.
Leading to compromise theories.
Right. Things like the gap theory, a
Right.
gap between Genesis 1.1 and 1.2, or the day-age theory, the days of creation were long ages. Attempts to fit geological time into Genesis.
And theistic evolution. God guiding the process.
That became a major way to reconcile. Asa Gray tried to convince Darwin, but Darwin didn't buy the guided part. The Catholic Church, initially resistant, eventually came to accept forms of theistic evolution, influenced by thinkers like Newman and Teilhard de Chardin.
Teilhard de Chardin saw evolution as a spiritual journey.
Yes, a sort of cosmic evolution toward a divine endpoint became very influential. Protestant churches also largely moved towards accepting theistic evolution, though it caused splits between liberals and conservatives.
So evolution, initially seen as just a scientific alternative to miracles, paved the way for broader atheism or secularism.
The text argues it did, provided a plausible naturalistic origin story that didn't require God. Mentions Hegel's philosophy, Wellhausen, using evolutionary ideas to critique the Bible's historical accuracy.
But the text also mentions archaeology potentially supporting early biblical accounts.
Yes, things like the Ebla tablets, suggesting complex societies existed earlier than Wellhausen's model allowed. And again, the widespread flood legends aligning with Genesis, counter evidence to purely developmental views.
Which leads to the idea of evolution itself as a kind of belief system.
The text quotes scientists admitting it's hard, maybe impossible, to falsify the overarching theory. Cites Harrison Matthews calling it a satisfactory faith, comparable to special creation in that sense.
So functioning as a worldview, not just science.
That's the argument. A non-physical belief system used to interpret the physical world.
And this worldview had major social and political consequences. Social Darwinism.
Absolutely. Applying survival of the fittest to society. Spencer Galton's eugenics, breeding better humans based on inherited traits.
Which had horrific consequences.
Directly influencing Nazi ideology, justifying racism and mass murder based on perceived biological inferiority, a terrible outcome.
The text mentions the nature versus nurture debate. Flawed studies.
Right. Burt's twin studies, later discredited. Then sociobiology Wilson, trying to explain social behavior genetically, drawing criticism for potentially justifying discrimination, contrasted with Boas showing environment's huge impact.
And even connects evolution to pushes for free love and secular humanism.
Briefly mentions Margaret Mead's work, though later controversial. Positions secular humanism, as outlined in the Humanist Manifesto, as a worldview explicitly built on evolution, rejecting God and emphasizing human self-reliance and progress.
Wow. We have covered an incredible amount of ground. From ancient philosophy to modern genetics, revelation, reason, geology, biology, hoaxes, social impacts. It's a complex story.
It really is. This text weaves together centuries of thought, showing how questions about origins answered through revelation, reason, or science have profoundly shaped everything from personal belief to political systems.
And so many questions linger. The age of the Earth, the fossil gaps, the precise mechanisms of life. The debates clearly aren't over.
Far from it. As the text shows, scientific understanding itself evolves, interpretations change, and old questions sometimes resurface in new ways.
So a final thought for you, our listener. Given all these shifting interpretations, the assumptions underlying different ways of knowing, the sheer complexity we've discussed, how do you navigate this? What does it really mean to be well-informed about our origins when the ground keeps shifting? Something to ponder on the interplay of faith, reason, and science in your own view. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.